Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event on rethinking extreme heat visuals. I'm Laurie Goering, and I'm the extreme heat editor for Climate Resilience for All, and I'm formerly a foreign correspondent for the Chicago Tribune and the climate change editor for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and I'll be your moderator today. We're going to be discussing the need to rethink the images that represent extreme heat with a panel of frontline photographers and other experts. And we'll be introducing some new guidelines we've developed along with climate visuals to aid photographers in the sometimes challenging quest to photograph an invisible threat. We have an hour for this event, and we're going to devote the last segment to your questions. So please do put those in the chat as we go along, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We'll also be recording this event, and we can send around a link later to those who are interested. So, we all know what traditional images of heat waves look like, right? Often there's something that looks fun. Kids splashing in the water, cooling off in fountains, people eating ice cream, this kind of thing. But they don't have to look like that, and they shouldn't look like that anymore. What we'd like to do now is show you a few of the images that we think might be the ones that we really need to be talking about these days. Fast-growing extreme heat threats are now the biggest killer among climate change impacts. That's just a reality. So how can photographers and videographers accurately portray extreme heat as the serious threat that it is, and also show some of the solutions and ways that people are adapting to this? Our panelists for this event today include Kathy Bothman-McLeod, who's the CEO of Climate Resilience for All, Alistair Johnston, who is manager of Climate Visuals, Supratim Bhattacharjee, who's an award-winning Kolkata-based climate change, environment, and humanitarian photographer, Bhumika Saraswati, who's an award-winning New Delhi-based writer, photographer, and filmmaker, and I may jump in as your moderator too. So I'd like to start with Kathy. Can you just tell us a little bit about extreme heat and why we should be worried about this and thinking about shifting these images?
Helps to get off of mute. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Laurie. First, Climate Resilience for All, for those who don't know, we're a global NGO dedicated to the protection of the health and livelihoods of women and vulnerable communities from extreme heat. And extreme heat is killing more people than any other climate hazard. And for today's point, it's because it's invisible and it's silent is part of why it's so hard for people to grasp how dangerous it is. And that makes the way that we depict it and show it even more important, because the number one agenda for addressing extreme heat is to know about it and to know what to do about it and to have the capacity to do that, whatever those things are. And so no one has to die from extreme heat. And I think one of the things about this and why this is so exciting is that we're beginning to share the awareness that women are profoundly and disproportionately impacted by extreme heat, and how and why. And I'll give you a few reasons. One, physiologically, our hormones, our organs, and our body temperature is different. And so women are already running hotter than men. And so it's not just that, there's fluctuation. And there's also cultural reasons. Women are not, so we work very closely with the Self-Employed Women's Association and other organizations where women are have to be home with their kids at night. But when shifts to work outside have been shifted to later at night when it's cooler, they can't work those shifts because they have to take care of their kids. And so they're missing a shift and they're missing income. And with our partner in Pakistan, women for cultural reasons need to sleep inside, and men and boys can sleep out on the porch where the air is flowing. And so that's more damage on the body, and women are the caretakers. So they're sick themselves, this double burden of taking care of yourself because you're sick and taking care of your parents, your senior, elder relatives, your children. You're over a hot stove, you're going further for water. I could go on and on. And so depicting that is really important. And when it's silent and deadly and it doesn't have that dynamism, that great TV that is a hurricane and a cyclone with the tree is going like this, or the car is floating down the street in a big flood. It just doesn't have that. And it's accelerating. Scientists are in new territory because El Nino is receding, this weather phenomenon that has had us expecting it to be so hot. It's receding, and yet it is still breaking records day after day. And so for those reasons, we could even give it some economic reasons. The heat costs the U.S. economy $100 billion every year, starting in 2020. If we don't do some adaptation, that's only in labor productivity losses. And so nighttime temperatures are really important. So heat is a 24-hour story. This is part of what we want to convey. And so we want people to see it and understand it. And we know that a picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say. And we have been, and for good reasons, conveying the wrong picture. And so we're thrilled to partner with Climate Visuals to share new guidelines, which Laurie and Alistair are going to talk about, and to really think about how the interventions. And this is not just about impact and just about effects of heat. It's about the things that are working to protect people's lives and livelihoods. And so it's also exciting. So anyway, let us get into the conversation, but we're delighted to be here today. We thank these fabulous photographers and journalists and Alistair for the partnership. And back to you, Laurie. And our motto, when women are climate resilient, we will all be climate resilient. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Yeah, I mean, I think that Alistair and I have been thinking for a while, and I'm sure many photographers around the world have been as well, about how you do portray this invisible thing and how we can really rethink that. I know it wasn't that many years ago we were thinking about, just with climate change images, remember the polar bears and the smokestacks, and trying to get away from that. Basically, it's now time to do that with heat. So, Alistair, I'd like to turn to you. We've developed this new set of principles that might be helpful to people who are trying to do this, because it's not easy for lots of reasons, is it?
It really is. And yeah, thanks, Laurie. It's great to be here. And thanks everyone for joining us. It's really exciting to be launching this resource, and hopefully it will be useful to everyone working with the photography of extreme heat. So yeah, as Laurie mentioned, all too often the imagery used to depict and visualize extreme heat really doesn't communicate its reality. We've all seen those images of people enjoying hot weather, and we've also all probably seen those same images used alongside alarming headlines and to illustrate written pieces detailing severe impacts and risks to daily life. So the purpose of these guidelines really is to promote a more accurate visual language for the photography and videography of extreme heat. We all know that images can be really powerful tools in communicating this reality to audiences. But in order to achieve this, we just really need to move away from those familiar visual cliches. So yeah, as Laurie mentioned, really excited with this aim. We developed these 9 principles to think about when you're working visually on this subject. And that might be as a photographer yourself or a videographer, but also as a commissioner, an editor, or a communicator, and really publishing images of heat in any context. So to kick it off, firstly, extreme heat is not actually fun. Images of people splashing in fountains, swimming at beaches, eating ice cream, we all know them. They're a long-time staple of stories about heat waves and hot days. They're relatively easy to shoot, particularly at short notice, and can make for really nice, bright and colourful pictures. But they're really not a full or accurate reflection of the growing level of impact associated with this extreme heat. So portraying heat simply as fun in the sun can really reduce its perception of the risk, and misses an opportunity to help people better understand what is a real and growing threat in everyday life. So following on from this, we want to encourage people to approach extreme heat photography as more than just a weather story. Photography can really help communicate this. So photographs of extreme heat should not just be standalone weather pictures, but instead they should tell stories about how high temperatures affect different aspects of everyday life, from health through to transport to jobs and businesses. They should be engaging and easy to relate to and provide context and detail and nuance. One way of thinking about this really is to focus in on the most effective. We all know that creating heat visuals isn't easy. It's hard to depict and access is often a challenge. But thinking about who might be struggling most on a hot day can be a really helpful starting point. That might be those working outside, such as construction workers or delivery people, the emergency services, or maybe farmers, or also those working inside without adequate cooling, including factory or warehouse workers. Another way of looking at it is those that are highly at risk, including the elderly or disabled people, maybe very young children or pregnant women, or those that are affected by cultural or physical restrictions that might prevent them from leaving their homes to seek cooler shade. As always, it's particularly important, and this is doubly true when working in sensitive and vulnerable situations. It's utterly vital to prioritize an ethical practice when working on these stories, ensuring you develop full and informed consent with those that you're collaborating with on the photography. Another good way of thinking about this is how can you actively portray the risks and impacts for everyday people in a way that is relatable and engaging to your audience. That might be families seeking shade outside homes with fans or air conditioning, maybe medical workers treating people with heat stroke or other health impacts, or as we talked about before, outdoor workers or indoor workers in conditions that are too hot. These are all stories that can resonate with wide-ranging audiences. But while you're thinking about that, while you're thinking about how you can resonate with your audiences on impacts, it's also worth thinking about how to visualize the effects of heat alongside the interventions that might be helpful in these situations to reduce the risk of extreme heat. So maybe consider how you might combine images of heat impacts with more constructive visuals of how to reduce such threats. These might be people benefiting from the cooling impact of shade structures or vegetation, trees or parks or water access areas in cities. It might also include early warning signs with advice to residents, people accessing public cooling centres, elderly residents in care homes sitting in front of fans or air conditioning, or maybe construction workers wearing cooling vests or taking more frequent breaks. We know from climate visuals as evidence-based that images of climate impacts, and that includes extreme heat, they are emotionally powerful, and they're emotionally powerful for audiences, but they can also promote this sense of overwhelming feeling within those looking at them. People can feel hopeless looking at them. So I think it's worth considering when you're photographing the impacts of extreme heat on daily life. Consider how you can couple those images with visuals of concrete behavioral actions that people can take, that people can engage with, and that maybe they can take into their own daily life and their own experience to lower their risks. This next one might sound really quite obvious, and it's, I'm sure, something anyone who's working with photography is thinking about all the time. But again, with heat, just really worth prioritizing, thinking about the story from the perspective of your audience. It's really worth thinking about the heat problems that your particular audience might face. That might be maybe long, hot commutes or working in an inadequately cooled workplace that's a major local employer. So can you think about how in your imagery you can focus on relatable, engaging local stories, and then also include within that any local impacts, but also local solutions too. You can use these images to help your audience connect a local experience with a shared and more global story. So showing local impacts and engage with your audience's lives and experiences where that's possible has the potential to really boost engagement with your visual stories. Something else that we would encourage people to think about when they're working on these images is actually rethinking when they're taking the images and when they're producing the content. Shooting extreme heat images at the hottest part of the day obviously does make sense, but heat affects much longer periods beyond that each day, including nights when people might be struggling to sleep, and problems such as deteriorating mental health or worsening domestic violence may occur. So it's again thinking about how you can tell new, nuanced, detailed stories that really show the wide-ranging impacts of extreme heat and try to move beyond those more familiar images that we all know so well now. This next point of guidance really gets to the heart about thinking of extreme heat as more than just a weather story, and that's really building sources and seeking access for your imagery ahead of time. Treat extreme heat like other stories that require detailed forward planning and ongoing work to cover effectively. it can obviously be really very difficult to get access to a hospital, ambulance crews, schools or care homes to allow access to shoot at really short notice, particularly when it's a very hot day and they may be very busy. But if you approach officials and institutions ahead of the heat season, explain what you're trying to portray and build real detailed relationships with them, you might find access easier and be in a position to tell detailed visual stories when a heat wave does hit. We all now know that we can expect to be covering extreme heat stories every year, and this is a subject that demands and deserves a serious level of forward planning in that regard. So it's really important with all of those in mind to come back to one that, again, hopefully is quite obvious, but I think we just need to reiterate it over and over again, and that is take care of yourself when you're working. Extreme heat can be debilitating or even deadly for everyone trying to do their job on a hot day, and that obviously includes photographers and videographers working on assignment. Remember to take regular breaks, drink plenty of water, wear cool clothing, and stay in the shade as much as possible, and really pay attention to how you're feeling when you're working. You may obviously need to change your working practices, and looking forward to hearing more maybe from the two photographers who join us on this call later on. But for example, little things like choosing not to file from your car, instead going out into a cool space, or just working at different times of day. But really look after yourself too when you're working and prioritize how you're feeling as well. So hopefully these principles provide a useful and practical framework for thinking about extreme heat visuals in a detailed and nuanced way. Photography and videography can obviously be a really powerful tool in communicating the reality of extreme heat. But in order to achieve this, we really must move away from the familiar visual cliches and instead develop and produce compelling, accurate, and detailed visual storytelling that really engages audiences on a deeper level. So I'll hand back to you, Laurie. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Alistair. I know that with those principles were up there very briefly. If you look in the chat, you'll be able to see links to those on the Climate Resilience for All and the Climate Visuals websites. So they're accessible there if you want to take a look. And we'll have them out on social media and in other ways as well in the coming days. Thank you for that. It is really interesting how much thought this takes to do this really well. And I think it's so worth putting this thought in now, because we know that we're only going to have hotter years. You hear over and over again, this is the coolest summer that we'll remember for some time, because the continuing use of coal, oil, and gas continues to drive climate change, and that's continuing to drive temperatures higher. So we'll be dealing with this for some time as we try to shift our economy, and even after, because these impacts are baked in and will be lasting for a while. I want to turn now to our full panel. And we're just hoping to have a conversation about this. We would love to hear your ideas and your questions if you put them into the chat, so we can include some of those in what we're talking about and in our question session at the end. So please go ahead and do that as you have time. I want to start first with Super Team, who's both of these photographers that we have on the panel with us today have been shooting in these incredibly hot conditions that have been happening in India this year. And they have firsthand experience both of trying to create these new visuals and of actually dealing with shooting in this heat. And I'm curious to hear them talk about both of these things. So Super Team, if you wouldn't mind going first, how hard is it to create these new kind of images? I mean, how are you finding that? And how has it been for you shooting in this heat? You know, are you finding ideas that work for images and for keeping yourself cool out there?
Hi everyone, thanks for inviting me. And I've been hello.
Hi, Super Tim. We can hear you. Can you put on your would you mind putting on your camera, or are you having trouble with the connection?
Just a moment. Yeah.
Super Team is joining us from Kolkata, and hopefully the connection will be terrific today. But I have asked the panelists that if they have any difficulty with the bandwidth to turn the cameras off. So we'll see.
I think they're rejoining.
Hi, Bhumika.
Hi, Laurie.
Would you like to go first as Super
Sure.
Team sorts out his getting the
Yeah, yeah,
camera on?
yeah.
That might make
Okay.
some sense. Now, Bhumika, I know you've been shooting in the extreme heat this season, and I know one of the things you were really concerned about is you were seeing firsthand how these impacts are affecting people really differently depending on where they live and the access to different kinds of cooling and other things. Can you tell us a little bit about that and then how that influenced how you were shooting images?
Right. So hi everybody, I'm Bhumika, and I started shooting Heat 2 years ago, and I started shooting Heat as a full-time thing, as a personal project, because I realized that each year there's a peak where there are a lot of conversation about heat, and in India specifically, there are articles about 100 people dying of heat in a specific state, but these articles or these photographs don't reveal who these people really are, right? There's always vulnerable communities are most affected or marginalized communities are most affected, but who are these marginalized communities? What do they look like? Is the question here. So I started with the Heat South Asia personal project where I was shooting, and because I was shooting throughout the year, I realized that it impacts our food security, it impacts everything from small to big, and heat is ideally not equal to all of us, because when these news articles come that 100 people dying of heat in India, who are these 100 people? These are not people who have access to AC, right? These are people who come from a certain caste background. These are people who come from a certain class background and certain gender. And it is the intersection, at least in South Asia, the intersection of caste, class, and gender that really reveals how heat impacts a certain individual. And when I was shooting, I decided to also shoot outside of the urban center. So I went to rural India, and what I realized was that women, after as Kathy also pointed out, after taking care of the children from early morning, a lot of women, and most of them Dalit women farm laborers, were working in the fields in the sun, wearing winter gloves. The gloves that we usually wear in winter. And you would not believe me, I clicked these photographs in February when it's ideally supposed to be cooler. February is supposed to be cooler in India, in entire South Asia. But first heat wave last year hit in February. And here were these women who were wearing additional layer, because of traditional reasons. After clothing, women are expected to wear shirts, the husband's shirt or other things to cover up, and winter gloves. So all these I just, and a lot of these, because I also come from one of the marginalized communities in India, and I realize that it's very important to point these things out as you click them and photograph them, because if you don't, it's only half the reality. And otherwise, the general imagery that exists or that comes about every year is random people. There would be random people being photographed, or people drinking water, or like certain very very stereotypical images, which often do an injustice, not just like is often volatile and does injustice to the person who you're photographing also. The other person deserves the dignity of being named who they are, of revealing their identity, of what makes them who they are. Do they have enough land? How are they reaching to a point where they are the ones who are experiencing more heat than you? So those are just certain things that I would and it's very funny that most times when there's extreme heat, a lot of my friends would go to hill stations or other places, and I would be like, oh, I have to shoot, like, it's my time to shoot. But I mean, I was working with Laurie for climate resilience for all, and I remember the number of times I felt sick while shooting heat. And the truth is that I'm still very privileged to come back to a room that gives me comfort. There are so many people who constantly were feeling sick during heat. Women who were constantly feeling sick. I met women who were telling me that they're getting more infections, during the heat also, because they're constantly sweating. Their internal clothes are all drenched in sweat, and most times they have to sit on the pavement, under the sun, because they're selling stuff. So all these other details about, I think need to be acknowledged. And I start, at least this year we're having heat conversation. When I started this work 2 years ago, there weren't much conversations. So I went with the aim that, there's just a need to at least capture these visuals
Yes.
as archives also, because we will look back at this time, of what did the warmest night of the decade look like, and by the time we should have visuals as to how do we reach to this point where people are dying, and all these are preventive deaths ideally. All of these are preventive deaths. If only if we slow down and document heat in that way and have conversation around early warning signals and things, it would just make things easier. I would not take much time.
Thank you. No, that you're right. There's such a role to play of photography because it's such a powerful medium in helping people understand these risks. Because if you portray heat as only fun and not a threat, that people really will have difficulty understanding that they for their own safety and that of the people they care about need to be thinking of this differently. Quickly before I come to you, Super Team, I wanted to just say
Yeah, I have rejoined,
some
and
of you have had trouble.
it was thundering outside, and that is why the internet has been disabled.
Okay, good. Well, at least it's cooler then. I know the chat has not been open for some of you. That is my fault. You should put your questions in the Q&A function. That should be open, and you'll be able to see them appearing in there. So please put any questions you have for our panel into the Q&A function. Super Team,
Yeah, tell
tell
me.
us about shooting. Have you found any kind of tips or ideas that seem to be working to really get strong images of this heat, something that's invisible as you've been doing this work?
Yeah, I have covered super cyclones to the droughts to the extraction of the fossil fuels and how it really impacts on the daily lives of the rural people. And what I have realized that the fossil fuel extraction to the super cyclones floods, they are limited to a certain zone. That means 50 square kilometer, 100 square kilometer areas are being affected. When we are talking about the heat, that means it expanded the entire country. The entire country is being suffered through the heat. But there should be, when you are talking about the how to express myself as a photographer to render a story, there I think what personally I do, there should be a two part. One is like our daily life. That means heat waves, you can't see heat waves. That means people are suffering, people are going to school, the children are going to school, people are going to catch their trains, bus, all like this. But the another part is that we need to get some good portrait shots so that their agony is being coming out, their emotions are being coming out. Because if you take a good emotional portrait, that does mean, because otherwise it would be like a daily life story. That means somehow their agony should be coming out from their inner soul so that the people will understand that how much sufferings they are going through. You are talking about that, how we show the story on a different way. So in my point of view, I think that one is our daily life and another part should be focus on their emotional moments. That means they are without emotion, you can't show that the people are being suffered through heat or like this. You need to have some emotions in your subjects.
Yeah, no, I agree, Super Team. I know some of the images that various
What personally I do in my projects, that the children are being I have been working in the coal mine regions for almost 10 years. And what I have seen that, yeah, whenever I go, I visit there, yeah, I take the same several shots. But after that, I realized that I have to take some good emotional portraits so that the inner feeling will be coming up. So somehow we have to capture the emotional images.
Yeah, I've seen some of the images that we've had up on our website since
And
we've been
again,
looking at this and
yeah,
trying to drive the right things. And I think some of the ones that have been really effective to me are things like a mother sitting on a hospital bed with their child who's sick because of the heat, or people fanning babies trying to
yeah,
or
yeah.
these images that show people in jobs that are very hot already, that they're working over a flame, they're cooking or they're doing something, and imagining that with the background of the heat that's already there, seeing the sweat on their faces. And I think
Yeah.
that's really powerful. Kathy, did you want to say something?
Well, I was going to go to Super Team's point about the emotions, and um, we have a program with the Self-Employed Women's Association called the Women's Climate Shock Insurance and Livelihoods Initiative, and in that we work to arrange a cash layer that is paid to, and the participants, there were 50,000 participants in the women in part of SEVA, and that when the temperature reached about 40 degrees C for Fahrenheit, I think that's like maybe 101, I have to do the math. And then in the next higher level at about 43 degrees C, you had an insurance that kicked in. And one of the participants said that her husband had a debt that he couldn't pay off. And he told her that she would have to work off the debt with this creditor who was not an unsavory character. And she knew that that meant predation for her and not good things. And she used the insurance to pay off that debt. And she said, I restored my dignity and my self-respect with this. And to capture that with an image, when you think about the emotions that come with this thing of heat, and then what it means, indebtedness, loss of income, physical ailments, caring for others. Bhumika, you said it, the women in heat exposed trades of SEVA have a rash that used to be for only 4 months out of the year is now every single day. They're losing pregnancies. They're burning their hands, blisters. And I mean, it's so pitched and so acute. And yet every death is preventable. And there are so many solutions, which are also, photogenic. But that emotion piece that you brought up, Super Team, is so important because heat is so much more than the temperature.
Yeah, exactly right, Kathy. The emotion is not just about the pain and the suffering of being in the heat, but it's about you can imagine the photos of the relief of someone who walks into a cooling center, and is able to sit down in the shade and have a glass of water or whatever. These are also powerful emotional images that help readers understand that there is something to be done about this, not just the suffering. Bhumika.
Yes, I was saying that there's one thing that I've realized and I believe vehemently is also that there can be climate justice is only possible if social justice is possible. So there is no climate justice without social justice. And so which means that like the existing layers in our society, for example, the patriarchal layer, the caste layer, and on the top of that the environment layer, which affects all of us. I think it's important to address all of these at once, while we are photographing or talking about heat. I think that's the only way possible, because even in rural India, while I was shooting, there were women from marginalized communities, from Dalit communities, who work on 350 rupees a day, which means not even $3, for per day. And the inability to go to work because she was sick because of heat. The heat was so intense that she was sick, so she had to. And I remember meeting her, and she was like, I've lost 4 days of labor, which means I've lost 4 days of work. So there needs to be conversation also about rehabilitation, and also like providing, I mean, just as Kathy was saying, so all that also needs to be, and even access to water, for example, like, in a country like ours where there is contaminated water or access to water, or when access to water itself is divided because of caste and other factors, it becomes important to be able to capture. For example, it's easy. You would see in heat that men would often go shirtless and be around during heat, but women who are sales worker or have to go out often have to wear the bralette, which in itself causes more irritation during heat. So there are other subtle details that just needs to be more slowly, with the slower approach, captured. And I think somebody put out a question to me about consent in the field. So my approach has been that I work long term with people. So it's not like I go to them and I start shooting heat. I have been shooting heat from the past 2 years. So there are people whose journey I have been clicking for over a period of time. And there's a trust that has been built, which is why they, you know, which is why those visuals are possible, and I don't just have visuals about women who are toiling who are in the field, but also those same women taking a break under the tree. There's a sisterhood within all these women where one woman is bringing water for all of them, and they're making an Instagram reel, and that also is a part of and that also is a part of resilience within heat, within an unequal society. So all these visuals are an attempt of mine. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That kind of solidarity among people facing this thing is another lovely thing to be showing, photographers can show. And Alistair, I was just thinking about these principles, that's exactly kind of what we were talking about, right? That that we need to be showing solutions, but also thinking about this forward planning, right? That you can't just waltz into the emergency services on a busy day and say, I want to shoot pictures of you treating people, because they don't know you. So it is, that principle about planning is really crucial, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. And that's planning in a very practical sense in terms of access. But as Bhumika mentioned, that's spending time with people and working in a trusting environment and being very open and honest about what the purpose of the images are and what the images are going to be used for, where they'll appear, and also the content of that story too, and having the time to develop those stories in collaboration with the people who are featured in the photograph. So you're not sort of necessarily just surveilling people, but you are working with them to tell a story that they have ownership of, an agency within. And so I think the kind of this concept of planning is as much getting in the door to something that is difficult and hard to access, but also planning how you will approach that in a sensitive way. And there's a question as well about avoiding creating caricatures and stereotypes. And I think, again, that comes into this kind of concept of needing to spend the time, know a story intricately, and as sort of from a commissioning side of things, working with photographers who know the community they're working with, know the story they're working on, are kind of intricately involved with it in their own right. They know the detail and they know the nuance, and they have the trust of the people they are working with. And all of this takes time. And for other stories, we obviously know that it takes time and it takes acting really sensitively and building things up slowly. But for often with heat, that maybe has up until now been missing a bit more. And it's something that happens and it's like, oh, we've got to be really reactive and we've got to go out and get those pictures. And then the weather moment passes. So what we're saying is all of this kind of like considered time and detail is really important, and the planning of that does need to be done in advance. But we know it's coming every year, we know it's coming back round, so think about the stories you want to be telling, think about how you can tell them responsibly and ethically and morally, and with the collaboration of the people who are in the photographs, and get going on that early so that when it comes around you can be ready to do it.
Can I ask you just one more question quickly, Alistair? There's one that our listeners today have put in, which is that how do you convince your colleagues who like the images of kids eating ice cream that we need to make this shift and that to have an accurate representation of the threat? I mean, we've all met the editors that are like that, right?
There will always be a place for both. I think it's not this kind of like we need to chuck the old ones out and put the new ones in, but the problem comes when one exists in the place of the other. So if you've got like hot weather holidays, that element of heat can be fun, that can be exciting, it can make for bright pictures that dress up pages in newspapers, but the point is it's not the only depiction of it, and so you don't want it to be the limit of the visual language for it. So we're not, I'm not saying ban them all, that's not how we should show it, but what we are advocating for is more nuance and more detail alongside those images. They don't have to be instead of, they just have to be as well, because otherwise we're ignoring a reality, and photography is not doing the reality justice in communicating that experience as well.
Yeah, that's right. We have quite a few questions in the chat about talked about this a little bit, but really this idea of how you're doing something so intimate often with these photos, showing someone who's struggling on a day, or fairly desperately trying to use some of the solutions or adaptations to feel better. What are the ethics like around this? What do you have to do as a photographer to feel like you're not being exploitative and you're really taking that into account, even around things about someone's asking about showing body parts in photography in societies where maybe, the displaying some of it is difficult. Is that just what we've been talking about, kind of really getting to know people, making sure they understand how this is going to be used, or is there anything else that's helpful? Alistair, Bhumika, super team.
Should I
Alistair,
go for it?
Bhumika, please go
Sure,
ahead.
sure. So, I think that's the best part about the visual medium, right? Everything does not have to be literal or direct. We can use metaphors, especially when somebody is talking about intimate things. We do use metaphors in those times. I think has been my approach, and also like personally for me, when I started documenting heat 2 years, 2.5 years ago, it started with my grandmother from my village coming to a house in Delhi because the heat was too intense, you know. And I was like, how intense can it be? Like it's only February. How intense can it be? And I traveled with her back to the village, and I saw only women workers in farm. And often when we imagine farmers, we often imagine male farmers because that's the imagery of farmers or farm protesters and things. But I could only see women farm laborers, working. And as soon as I went and I spoke to them, and a lot of them, once you tell them, a lot of them are very willing to share their story with you. If you're honest with them, truthful with them, honest with them, I think you build a relationship right there, and you carry that relationship forward. In fact, initially when I visited, I did not click any photos. I was just around, and next time I was like, would it be okay if I take photos and things? And then they wanted to make sure that I do click everything, that, oh, we are going now, it's the harvest season and it's going to get bad, or now this is happening, and I would get calls, you should come for this very season, or our crops are destroyed. And when there are sudden heat, when there is intense heat, there are also sudden rainfalls, which also destroy a lot of crops. And that destroying of crops disproportionately impact people from marginalized communities who don't have access to tractors or big machinery, right? So next time, I clearly remember when I had gone there after those sudden rain that happened for a day or two, a lot of crops were just slanted, and those crops would not be harvested anymore, and prices in Delhi rised, and if only there were enough warnings, if only we had informed the community, we could have saved those crops. And I still remember, and I clicked this photo, and it's also up on Heat South Asia. The woman is lying on those destroyed crops with a sense of, like it seems like it's a like a disaster, like a natural disaster, but it's actually preventable also. Like, these are things that can be prevented if we talk about them enough, and shoot them well enough. And and also because somebody mentioned about like intimate conversation, I've had women tell me that because there's a caste divide in India, and a purity politics that also happens within household, and a lot of women are not allowed to, a lot of domestic workers are not allowed to use washroom within the houses that they work in sometimes. So that because of that, they don't drink enough water. Now, how do you photograph that? Women are not able to access water during their work hours because there is no washroom, there is no toilet. So women are not drinking enough water. They are keeping themselves dehydrated. And they will get we will get heat stroke if that happens, right? So how do you photograph that? And that is when I think captions also come into play.
Yeah,
While
photographing something that's not happening is really, really challenging. Super team.
right, right. So
Yes, I have been working over the coal mines from the year of 2014. And what I have realized that in the midsummer, the temperature raised almost the 45 degrees Celsius, and the underground fire has been coming out. And the people, they have been staying just beside the fire, and they feel free to share their stories or like this. But being a professional photographer, and I have to, my focus was on their emotions and how they are spending their daily lives, how their daily life moves. And I have several stories because I have worked almost entire India. I have worked in the droughts in Maharashtra, and what I have seen that an early morning, the women, they woke up early in the morning, and their first job was to collect drinking water. After walking almost 5 kilometers, there was an well, then they brought drinking water from there. And at
So,
what,
Tim,
yeah.
will you talk us through one of the images you've shot that you think really like portrays this, that portrays this heat, and you've shot some amazing images. Talk us through one of those that you think really worked to kind of portray some of these principles and ideas and show this invisible thing.
Actually, my main focus is on the put the subject in a good background.
Okay.
I'm talking about the technical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you put your subject on a very powerful background, I play with my backgrounds. Because in the front line, you will see that their emotional face, and the background, you will see the destructive nature. Either it would be a heat, or it would be the flood, or it would be the drought, whatever it may be. So my main focus is to play with the backgrounds. I'm talking about how I goes with my work. And that kind of visuals is much needed, so that you can shoot daily life in a different way. It's not a big deal, because if you spend 10 days or 15 days for an assignment, then it automatically it comes out. But that's the thing is necessary, that you have to capture those powerful faces.
Yeah.
That's
But I think
how
what you're
that's how you are different. That kind of images makes you different from other photographers. That's the main part, because in nowadays everybody has their iPhone or cameras or like this. They can shoot whatever they like, but they can't capture those emotions, those backgrounds. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. And what you're saying too is that it takes a bit of time, that it's not
Yeah,
something you go out
absolutely,
in for an
absolutely.
hour and you
I'm a,
shoot
I'm a,
this.
I'm a long-term documentary photographer, and I've been working in Sundarbans for almost 2 decades.
Right.
And
Right.
people know me. I love long-term documentary, and you know, somehow you have to understand those landscapes, those peoples, how they move, how they work, how they eat, because food is the main factor. When you eat their food, then they realize that, yeah, you are one of them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So they are, when you eat their food, and what I have realized that you have to make I have a good bond with my subjects, no matter the situation is. And when I got the UNICEF photo of the year, and I got several donations for the Pallavi, and I gifted her all the amount. I gifted her, and I clicked her, and I sent those who have donated amounts. And that's kind of thing, it happens. And so being a photographer, what I can say, being an environmental photographer, and you have to capture how our world moves, and you
Yeah.
have to capture those powerful faces, those powerful stories. And that means you have to research a lot to make a powerful story. It's not a cup of tea that you'll go and you click thousands of images, because you have to think more.
It's a
How to
very
make
good
it,
point that
yeah,
doing
how
a
to
bit
make
of
it,
research in advance helps.
yeah, research is very much, research is almost 70%, and clicking is almost 30%.
And
Because when you do it, yeah, Kathy, please.
well, what I just to comment on that, and part of where we want to move for more mainstream standards of exhibiting heat for and there's so many photographers who aren't able to do super team what you're able to do. They're asked go out there and do this, or, this is due on Tuesday or whatever. And I think there's a range from the building that relationship in the 70% to can we, over time raise the, the image literacy, the visual visual literacy of photographers who are also going out to photograph the St. Patrick's Day parade and the Diwali's festival and all that sort of stuff. And so there's also that idea of like, okay, I have 24 hours, and so there's that time issue. But the other point I wanted to make is about mental health and heat driving gender-based violence and crime and depression and some things that are not visual, like heat. And so I wanted to just put that out, and it's also in the Q&A that, I mean, you can certainly photograph a damaged human body from violence or from crime, but the strain, the stress, the burden of, go back to the disproportionate burden on women, the emotional work that women are doing to take care of everybody, or to be victims of gender-based violence. Any thoughts from the panel? That is one of the biggest challenges, I think. It's also a taboo subject. It just is, and that we could love to see that change. Yeah.
Have any of you looked into doing those kind of getting at some of those other double hard to portray impacts, or shooting at night with heat at all, or any of that? Not
that's
sure.
how I
And this is all really new for a lot of us.
That's how I see it, that you have to make a good plan, you have to make a good research, you have to make a good pre-production so that you can move with your story. And otherwise, you can't make a different story. It would be like a daily shot, daily images. You have to make a good plan. When I worked with Kathy and Geraldine in the Ahmedabad, and I was when I reached there and I saw that the slums are a bit different. Then I made my plan that it was extreme heat, and I made my plan and I changed my plan on the day.
Okay. Alistair.
And it that kind of things happen because you need to have such kind of experience to understand those visuals, those what is happening in front of you. You have to understand.
Absolutely.
You have to have a good feeling.
Alistair.
Thanks. Yeah, I think obviously doubly hard to show, but I think one thing I would want to prioritize within that is that there are some things that you have to be so careful, obviously, in how you visualize them, and then in working with the people you're collaborating with on photography. And obviously, when you're kind of treading into subjects that are viewed as taboo, the risks that people are taking on in being part of those stories and in showing their kind of experience take on a kind of double level of importance. So I think I'd go towards what Bhumika was saying about visual metaphors and things like that, but actually all of these things should be off the table until you can be sure that you're doing it in a safe and ethical way. And actually you may find that some of these stories are at the limits of what it is possible to tell ethically through photography, and knowing where those limits sit and are is fine, and coming back from them to a place which is safe and back to them which is a place which is responsible is also fine too. I think it's like building in the human experience definitely through your photographs, telling empathetic and sincere stories through photography, but also just being very clear with yourself where those lines sit, and actually what is responsible and what isn't.
Bhumika.
Totally agree with you. And just to add to that, we did a story for Climate Resilience for All with Laurie. And if you remember, we started the story with and that's how text complement photographs. And I think that's very important also. We started the story by reiterating how with the women who we interviewed and clicked, they were telling us, because they sell at on the footpath of they sell on the street, they sell dry fruits on the street, the women. Our story, I think somebody will put it out. These women were telling us that that people who come to buy, there are lesser people who are coming to buy because the heat is too intense, and the people who are coming to buy are often agitated, are often more volatile, more angry with, because there's a whole irritability, and not just within the customer, but also, for example, the women who we interviewed, right? I mean, constantly fanning yourself because there are no cooling station where you're selling your stuff, constantly fanning yourself, and having to deal with people who are not talking to you in the best of way, and in that intense heat does become mentally challenging, and in the midst of all of that, dealing with, your family, your children, if they're around, things can get really, really irritable. And we have seen reports where, things have gone bad. There has been increase in domestic violence. There are reports that show that. So yeah.
Thank you. It is, we need to have so much more discussion about all of this. This is just an opening salvo in talking about this issue, and I'm aware we have less than 1 minute left. Just before I close, I wanted to ask, there's one point I think we haven't got out that's useful to talk about, which is that heat can affect everyone, affluent as well as the most vulnerable. And how do you capture this idea that we're all vulnerable here and now, not in the future, not, that because I live in a cool place and I have some money that I don't have to think about this. Does anybody have just a very quick comment on that?
I have oh no, Alistair, you go.
I was just going to say that I think this is where you want to think about it from who's going to be looking at your images and what perspective do they bring to the images, and then tell them, like, look for stories that will engage with that audience in that way, but then also use the photography to align that experience with the more shared, more global experience as well. So yeah, there will be differences in how people experience things, but like you say, everyone is affected in different ways. How can you use your images to tie those experiences together and suggest a kind of shared story, a shared experience, a shared perspective through photography? I think that's might sound like a bit of a cop out of an answer, but I think it's something photography can do really, really well. But it's just lots of stories and lots of pictures.
Well, I'm so sorry we haven't gotten to all of the questions. There's some fascinating things in here. I think we've talked a lot about the ethics, but things like using thermal imaging for photos to show heat, such an interesting idea. And I hope this will just be the first of a few of these discussions, and we can keep building on it. I think we were just saying that wouldn't it be fantastic to have a prize for heat photography to help drive this forward? We have to think about something like this down the road. But thank you so much for joining us. Thanks so much to all of our really amazing panelists. I know there's plenty of other great photographers out there too listening today, not least Mosber Hussein, who's also shot some pictures for us. You can see them all at our website at Climate Resilience for All. You can see them at Climate Visuals. The links to both of those are in the chat, and we'll send around a link to the event as well if you'd like to share it with anyone who's in the wrong time zone or just couldn't make it today. But thank you very, very much for joining us. I think this is such an important topic. I think there's so much work to do, and I feel really good that we're starting it and having these discussions. We would love to see the work that you're producing. Let's stay in touch and develop a community around this. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Laurie. Thanks, everybody. See you soon. Stay cool.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.